Imagine being a billionaire CEO, sitting in an upscale restaurant, about to sign a business deal worth millions. You pull out your pen and start to sign, when suddenly your waitress stops you cold with 4 impossible words. "That's my dad's signature." Your glass slips from your hand and shatters on the floor. Your heart stops, because you know exactly whose signature that is. And if this young woman is telling the truth, your entire world is about to be turned upside down. This is the story of what happened next. Marcus Wellington was a self-made billionaire, or at least that's what the world believed. At 52 years old, he was the CEO of Wellington Enterprises, a tech company worth over $3 billion. He drove a different luxury car each day of the week, owned mansions in 5 countries, and his face regularly appeared in business magazines as one of the most successful entrepreneurs of his generation. People admired his rise from nothing to everything, his brilliant business mind, and his seemingly unstoppable ambition. But Marcus carried a secret that had haunted him for 25 years, a secret he'd buried so deep, he sometimes almost convinced himself it never happened. On this particular Tuesday evening, Marcus sat in Le Chateau, one of the most exclusive restaurants in the city, preparing to sign a merger agreement with a Japanese tech firm. His lawyer sat across from him, papers spread across the white tablecloth, champagne already poured to celebrate the deal that would make Marcus another $100 million richer. It was just another business transaction in a long line of victories. Marcus pulled out his gold-plated fountain pen, the one he always used for important signings, and began to position the document. He didn't even notice the young black waitress approaching their table with water glasses until she was standing right beside him. Her name was Alana, and she was 23 years old, working 2 jobs to put herself through nursing school. Le Chateau was her evening job, where the tips were good enough to help pay for her textbooks and rent. She'd been raised by her grandmother after her mother died when she was just 2 years old. Her father, she'd been told, had died before she was born. Her grandmother rarely spoke about him, and the only thing Alana had of his was an old photograph and a framed document with his signature that her grandmother kept on the mantel like a shrine. As Alana set down the water glasses, her eyes accidentally fell on the signature Marcus was about to write. She froze. Her hands began to tremble so badly that water sloshed over the rim of one glass. That signature, that exact distinctive way of writing the letter M with the elaborate flourish, the specific angle of the letters, the tiny loop on the final stroke. She'd seen it 1,000 times growing up. She'd traced it with her fingers on that framed document at her grandmother's house. It was identical, so impossibly, unmistakably identical. Her voice came out as barely a whisper. "Sir, that's my dad's signature." The words hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. Marcus's pen stopped mid-stroke. His entire body went rigid. The color drained from his face, as if someone had opened a valve and let all the blood out. His hand began to shake, and the champagne glass he'd been holding in his other hand slipped from his fingers and shattered on the marble floor with a crash that made everyone in the restaurant turn to look. Marcus slowly raised his eyes to look at the young woman standing beside him. Really look at her. She had dark skin, warm brown eyes, and delicate features that suddenly seemed hauntingly familiar. Her hair was pulled back in a neat bun, revealing a face that made Marcus's heart stop. She looked exactly like someone he'd tried desperately to forget, someone he'd left behind 25 years ago, without ever looking back. His lawyer stared at him in confusion. "Marcus, are you all right? What's going on?" But Marcus couldn't speak. He couldn't breathe. His past had just walked up to his table and introduced itself. Alana's hands were shaking as she pulled out her phone with trembling fingers. "I'm sorry, I know this sounds crazy, but I have a picture." She showed him an old photograph of a young man in his 20s, standing beside a beautiful black woman, both of them smiling at the camera. The man in the photo was unmistakably a younger Marcus Wellington, though he'd gone by a different name back then. Marcus stared at the photo, memories he'd suppressed for decades flooding back with painful clarity. "That's my mother," Alana said, her voice breaking. "Shanice Johnson. And my grandmother said this man was my father, Michael Johnson. He died before I was born, but Michael Johnson hadn't died. He'd run away. 25 years ago, Marcus Wellington had been Michael Johnson, a struggling college dropout from the rough side of town, in love with Shanice, working 2 dead-end jobs and barely making rent. When Shanice told him she was pregnant, Michael had panicked. He wasn't ready. He was drowning in poverty, suffocating under the weight of a future that looked hopeless. So he made a choice that would define the rest of his life. He left, he changed his name, moved across the country, and rebuilt himself from nothing, leaving behind the woman he loved and the child he would never meet. Marcus's lawyer was speaking, asking questions, but the words sounded like they were coming from underwater. Marcus couldn't take his eyes off Alana. "Your mother," he finally managed to whisper. "Shanice's. What happened to her?" Alana's eyes filled with tears. "She died when I was 2. Cancer. My grandmother said the stress of being a single mother working 3 jobs to support me, it weakened her immune system. She never recovered." Each word was a knife to Marcus's heart. The woman he'd loved had died, worn down by the struggle he'd left her to face alone. The restaurant had gone completely silent. Other diners were watching this drama unfold, though they had no idea what they were witnessing. Marcus's lawyer gathered up the papers awkwardly. "Perhaps we should reschedule this meeting," he suggested quietly, recognizing that whatever was happening was far more important than any business deal. Marcus barely nodded, his eyes never leaving Alana's face. She had her mother's eyes, her smile, her gentle way of holding herself. And she had his signature, the one distinctive thing he'd never changed, the one piece of his old identity he'd kept, because he'd always secretly been proud of his handwriting. "I don't understand," Alana said, confusion and hurt mixing in her voice. "My grandmother said you were dead. She said you died in an accident before I was born. But you're alive. You're Marcus Wellington, the billionaire. And you were just sitting here about to sign a business deal worth more money than I'll see in my entire lifetime." The accusation in her voice was clear, even though she was trying to stay professional. Marcus felt like he was being crushed under the weight of his own guilt. He'd built an empire, accumulated more wealth than he could spend in 10 lifetimes, while his daughter worked as a waitress to afford nursing school. Marcus stood up slowly, his legs unsteady. "Can we talk?" "Privately." His voice was hoarse, barely recognizable even to himself. Alana looked at him with a mixture of emotions, anger, confusion, curiosity, and something that might have been hope. She glanced at her manager, who had noticed the commotion. After a brief conversation, Alana took off her apron and led Marcus to a quiet corner booth, away from the other diners. They sat across from each other, this father and daughter meeting for the first time, separated by a table and 25 years of lies and absence. "I didn't die," Marcus began, his voice heavy with shame. "I ran away. When your mother told me she was pregnant, I panicked. I was 23, broke, scared, and stupid. I convinced myself that I would only drag you both down, that you'd be better off without me. So I left. I changed my name, started over, built this life." He gestured vaguely at his expensive suit, his gold watch. "I told myself I was making the right choice. I told myself so many lies that I almost started to believe them. But I always knew I was a coward." Tears streamed down Alana's face. "My mother died thinking you loved her enough to stay. My grandmother told me stories about you, about how you and Mom were going to build a life together, how excited you were about having a baby." "Were those all lies?" Marcus shook his head, his own tears falling now. "No, I did love her. I loved her more than I've ever loved anyone. That's what made my betrayal so unforgivable. I didn't leave because I didn't care. I left because I was too weak to stay." "Do you know what it's like," Alana said, her voice breaking, "growing up without a father, watching other kids with their dads, wondering what mine would have been like if he'd lived? I used to talk to your picture. I used to imagine you watching over me from heaven. And all this time you were alive. You were building a fortune while my grandmother raised me on Social Security checks and my mother's life insurance, while I worked 2 jobs just to afford community college, while I wore second-hand clothes and ate ramen for dinner most nights. You were a billionaire, and I was your daughter struggling to survive." The words hit Marcus like physical blows, each one deserved, each one true. He had no defense, no excuse that could possibly justify what he'd done. "You're right," he said quietly. "I'm sorry doesn't even begin to cover it. I stole your childhood. I stole the life you should have had. I let your mother struggle alone until it killed her. I'm a monster who built an empire on the foundation of abandonment and betrayal." He looked at Alana with raw, honest pain. "I don't deserve your forgiveness. I don't deserve to even know you. But please, let me try to make some small part of this right." Alana laughed bitterly. "Make it right? How exactly do you make right 25 years of absence? How do you give me back my mother? How do you give me back a father?" Marcus had no answer. There was no answer. Some things once broken can't be fixed. They sat in heavy silence for a long moment. Finally, Alana spoke again, her voice softer now, exhausted by emotion. "My grandmother is sick. She has Alzheimer's. She doesn't remember much anymore, but she still remembers you. She still keeps that picture of you on the mantel." "I want to meet her," Marcus said immediately. "I want to apologize to her, to try to explain even though I know I can't. And I want to help. With her medical care, with your education, with anything you need. Not to buy forgiveness, I know I can't do that. But because it's the absolute least I can do after everything I've failed to do." Alana studied him for a long moment, trying to decide if this broken, guilty man in front of her deserved any kind of second chance. He'd abandoned her mother. He'd built a life of luxury while she struggled. But looking at him now, seeing the genuine anguish in his eyes, the complete destruction of his carefully constructed walls, Alana saw something else too. She saw a man who had made a terrible mistake when he was young, and had been running from it ever since. She saw a man who had achieved everything the world said mattered, but had lost everything that actually did. She saw a man who was finally being forced to face the consequences of his choices. And despite everything, despite the anger and hurt and betrayal, some small part of her wondered if it was possible to build something from these ruins. "I don't forgive you," Alana said firmly. "I may never forgive you. But maybe we can start with honesty. No more lies. No more running away. If you're serious about being in my life, about trying to make amends, then you do it the hard way. You meet my grandmother. You face what you did. You don't get to just write a check and feel better about yourself." Marcus nodded, accepting her terms without hesitation. "Whatever you want. Whatever you need. I'll do it the hard way. I promise." Over the following weeks, Marcus did exactly that. He visited Alana's grandmother in the modest assisted living facility where she stayed, paid in full by Alana's waitressing money. When the elderly woman saw him, even through the fog of Alzheimer's, recognition flickered in her eyes. "Michael? Michael, you came back." She'd cried, and so had he. He told her everything, apologized for everything, and listened as she told him about Shanice's final days, the daughter he'd never known. It was the hardest conversation of his life, but he sat through every painful moment because he owed them that much and more. Marcus set up a trust fund for Alana's grandmother's care, ensuring she'd spend her final years in comfort. He paid off all of Alana's student loans and established a scholarship fund in Shanice's name for single mothers pursuing nursing degrees. But more importantly, he showed up. He came to Alana's nursing school graduation. He met her friends. He learned about her life, her dreams, her favorite foods, her fears. He didn't try to force a relationship or demand to be called Dad. He earned his place in her life slowly, painfully, one honest conversation at a time. It wasn't redemption. Redemption might never come, but it was accountability, and that was a start. The business world was shocked when Marcus Wellington stepped down as CEO of Wellington Enterprises to focus on philanthropic work and family. The merger deal he'd been about to sign that fateful night never went through. Marcus didn't care. He'd spent 25 years chasing money and success, thinking that's what mattered. But when Alana called him on his birthday, just to check in and see how he was doing, Marcus felt wealthier than all his billions had ever made him feel. He finally understood what he'd thrown away all those years ago, and what he'd been given a chance, however small, to rebuild. Alana eventually introduced Marcus to her boyfriend, and later, he walked her down the aisle at her wedding. Though they both acknowledged the bittersweet irony of him being there for that moment when he'd missed so many others. When Alana had her first child, a baby girl, she named her Shanice. Marcus held his granddaughter and wept, thinking of the woman he'd loved and lost, the daughter he'd abandoned, and the grace he'd been shown despite deserving none of it. He'd learned the hardest lesson of his life, that running from your past doesn't free you, it imprisons you. This story reminds us that our choices have consequences that echo far beyond what we can imagine. Marcus Wellington had everything the world said mattered, but he'd built it all on a foundation of abandonment and betrayal. It took his daughter's courage to speak 4 simple words to shatter his carefully constructed life and force him to finally face the truth. Sometimes the most expensive thing we can lose isn't money or status, but the relationships and opportunities we throw away while chasing them. And sometimes, if we're incredibly fortunate, we get a chance to make amends for our worst mistakes.